The lights in El Paso hadn't fully dimmed yet when something unusual began to unfold backstage. The echoes of the crowd were still vibrating through the walls, a lingering reminder of yet another explosive performance by BTS. Staff members moved quickly, voices overlapping, footsteps urgent, post-show chaos in its most familiar form. But in the middle of all that motion, there was stillness. Jimin didn't leave. At first, no one thought much of it. It wasn't uncommon for members to take a moment after a show, catch their breath, hydrate, exchange a few quiet words. But minutes passed, then more, and while others gradually filtered out, guided by managers or pulled into different directions, Jimin remained in place, just slightly off to the side, as if anchored there by something invisible. Fans didn't notice it immediately. These are the kinds of moments that don't scream for attention. They whisper. They sit quietly in the background until someone, somewhere, pieces them together. And when they did, everything changed. Because this wasn't just waiting. It was familiar. A staff cam clip surfaced, barely 10 seconds long, shaky, partially obstructed. It wasn't meant to capture anything significant, but there he was, Jimin. Still in stage outfit, slightly slouched, gaze fixed toward the corridor leading from the stage entrance. Not checking his phone, not talking much, just there, waiting. Then came another angle, a fan-recorded glimpse from a distance catching a similar moment from earlier that night. Same posture, same direction of gaze, same quiet energy that didn't match the surrounding rush. That's when the first comments started appearing. Why is he still there? Is he waiting for someone? And then the name that shifted everything into focus. Jungkook. Because when Jungkook finally appeared, slightly later than the others, pulled back briefly by something no one clearly saw, the moment that followed didn't look accidental. There was no dramatic run, no loud reaction, no overt display, but the shift was undeniable. Jimin moved. Not toward the exit, toward him. It was subtle, almost too subtle. But in fandom spaces, subtlety is never overlooked. It's analyzed, replayed, slowed down, compared, remembered. And what fans began to realize wasn't just about El Paso, it was about a pattern. Because this wasn't the first time. Threads started forming across platforms, connecting moments that once felt isolated. Old clips resurfaced, airport footage, backstage glimpses, award show transitions. Moments where one member lingered just a little longer, moments where leaving didn't happen until both were accounted for. Wait, hasn't this happened before? Yes, more times than people initially realized. In one clip from a previous tour stop, Jimin is seen walking ahead with staff only to pause midway, turning back briefly. Seconds later, Jungkook appears behind him, and without a word, they continue forward, this time side by side. In another, Jungkook finishes an interaction with fans while others have already moved toward the exit. The camera pans slightly, and there, just outside the main path, is Jimin, standing quietly, waiting. Not calling out, not signaling, just staying. Individually, these moments felt small, coincidental even, easy to dismiss. But together, they told a story. A quiet one, a consistent one. And suddenly, El Paso didn't feel like a random occurrence anymore. It felt like confirmation. Fans began calling it the waiting pattern. Not a rule, not something spoken, but something observed, again and again. One stays until the other arrives. What made this theory resonate wasn't just repetition, it was intention. Because in an environment like a world tour, where schedules are tight, movements are managed, and time is constantly monitored, lingering isn't always easy. It requires choice. And choice implies meaning. That's where the emotional weight began to settle. Because if Jimin could have left but didn't, then the question wasn't just why, it became for who? And the answer, at least to fans, felt increasingly clear. Jungkook. But the theory didn't stop at identifying the pattern. It went deeper, into the why behind it. Some fans described it as comfort, a silent reassurance at the end of overwhelming nights. After the lights, the noise, the pressure, there's one constant, one person you look for before fully stepping away. Others saw it as habit, something formed over years, not planned, not discussed, just naturally built through shared experiences until it becomes second nature. You don't even think about it anymore. You just wait. And then there were those who saw something even intimate, not just comfort, not just habit, but priority. Because waiting, in its simplest form, is time given freely. It's choosing not to move forward until someone else is beside you. It's quiet, but it speaks loudly, especially when no one asks you to do it. El Paso added another layer to this interpretation. Because the environment that night was particularly hectic, reports mentioned tighter transitions, slight delays, increased coordination behind the scenes. In situations like that, every second matters, which made Jimin's stillness stand out even more. He wasn't caught in the rush. He stepped out of it and stayed there until Jungkook returned. One fan comment captured the sentiment perfectly. It's not about how long he waited, it's about the fact that he chose to. That idea spread quickly because it reframed everything. This wasn't about dependency. It wasn't about necessity. It was about preference. Given the choice to leave, he didn't. And that's what made it feel real. As more clips surfaced, fans began analyzing micro-details: the direction of Jimin's body, the timing of Jungkook's arrival, the way their movements aligned once they were together again. There was no need for overt interaction. The synchronization itself was enough. They walked out within seconds of each other, not rushed, not delayed, just together. And in a space where every movement is often dictated by schedules and structure, that alignment felt almost personal, something chosen within the boundaries, something small but intentional. The waiting pattern theory quickly evolved beyond El Paso. It became a lens through which fans began revisiting countless past interactions. Moments that once passed unnoticed now carried new meaning. That pause before leaving the stage, that glance toward the side, that slight delay before stepping into a car. Each one added another piece to the puzzle. And while no official confirmation existed, no statement, no explanation, the consistency itself became its own form of evidence in the eyes of fans. Because patterns don't form without repetition, and repetition rarely happens without reason. Still, what made this theory particularly compelling wasn't just the actions themselves, it was the way they felt. Quiet, unforced, almost invisible unless you were looking closely. And maybe that's why it resonated so deeply. Because in a world of loud performances and constant visibility, this was something different, something softer, something that didn't ask to be seen, but meant something when it was. As discussions continued to grow, one question kept resurfacing. If this really is a pattern, how long has it been happening? And more importantly, how many times have we missed it? The question lingered in the air of fandom spaces like a quiet echo. How long has this been happening, really? Because once you start seeing a pattern, it becomes almost impossible to unsee it. Fans began digging deeper, not just revisiting recent tours, but going years back. Old concert footage, behind-the-scenes DVDs, airport clips, award show transitions. Moments that once felt ordinary were suddenly placed under a new lens. And what they found only strengthened the theory. There were pauses, small ones, easy to miss, but they were there. In one resurfaced clip from years ago, the members were exiting a venue after a long night. The camera angle was wide, slightly shaky, capturing a group moving forward together. One by one, they passed through the exit, but then there was a gap. Jimin wasn't among them. The camera lingered just a second longer, and there he was, a few steps behind, not walking, not distracted, just standing. And then, almost on cue, Jungkook appeared from the opposite side, adjusting something on his outfit, clearly having been held back for a moment. Jimin didn't wave, didn't call out. He simply started walking the second Jungkook aligned beside him. And just like that, they exited together. No words, no attention drawn, but the timing? Too precise to ignore. Another clip, this time from an airport arrival. The members had already begun heading toward their vehicles, surrounded by staff and security. It was a familiar scene, fast-paced, tightly managed. Jungkook was slightly behind, momentarily stopped by something off camera, and ahead, Jimin slowed down. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough that when Jungkook caught up, there was no distance left between them. Again, no acknowledgement that the camera could clearly catch, no exaggerated gestures, but the synchronization? It was there. And that's what made it so compelling, because this wasn't behavior meant for the spotlight. If anything, it existed just outside of it. Fans began calling these moments micro-waits, tiny pauses that lasted only seconds, but carried a weight far beyond their duration. Moments where movement was delayed, where exits weren't immediate, where something or someone was being accounted for before moving forward. And the more examples that surfaced, the harder it became to dismiss them as coincidence, because coincidence doesn't repeat itself this consistently. One fan theory thread broke it down in a way that quickly gained traction. If it happens once, it's random. If it happens twice, it's interesting. But if it keeps happening, it's intention. That word, intention, became the center of the conversation, because intention changes everything. It suggests awareness, choice, meaning. And suddenly the narrative shifted from they happen to leave together to something much more layered. They choose to. El Paso, in this context, felt less like a starting point and more like a moment of clarity, a recent, undeniable example that made everything else click into place. Because the environment that night had been anything but slow. Multiple reports described slate delays, tighter coordination, increased urgency backstage. In that kind of setting, waiting isn't convenient. It stands out. And yet, Jimin waited anyway, which led fans to another layer of the theory, what they began calling the exit sync. The idea was simple but striking. No matter how chaotic the situation, there seemed to be an unspoken alignment when it came to leaving, not entering, not performing, but leaving. As if the end of something, the closing of a stage, a moment, a night, held a significance that required both of them to be present, together. Some fans connected this to emotional grounding. After hours of performance, adrenaline, and external energy, there's a natural need to return to something familiar, something steady. And if that something happens to be a person who has been there through it all, then waiting makes sense. Others interpreted it as a form of quiet check-in, not verbal, not obvious, but present. A way of saying, without saying anything at all, I'm here. We're done. Let's go. And perhaps that's what made the theory resonate so deeply across the fandom. It didn't rely on dramatic gestures or explicit confirmation. It relied on consistency, on subtlety, on moments that felt real precisely because they weren't performed. As the discussion continued to grow, more nuanced observations began to emerge. Fans started analyzing body language, not just actions. The way Jimin positioned himself while waiting, never too far, never too close to the main flow. The way Jungkook's pace seemed to adjust once he rejoined. There was a rhythm to it, unspoken but recognizable, like two people who don't need to coordinate out loud anymore because they already understand the timing. And then came one of the most talked about observations, the no-look confirmation. In several clips, when Jungkook finally reaches Jimin, there's no immediate eye contact, no visible acknowledgement that would make the moment obvious to anyone watching casually. But something shifts. Their steps align, their direction matches, their pace becomes the same. And in that alignment, fans see something deeper than a glance could ever show. Familiarity, comfort, knowing. It's the kind of connection that doesn't need to be displayed because it exists regardless of who's watching. And maybe that's why it feels so convincing, because it doesn't try to convince anyone. It just is. Of course, not everyone interprets these moments the same way. Some see them as simple teamwork, the natural coordination of people who have spent years working closely together. Others view it as friendship, deep, long-standing, and built on trust. And those interpretations are valid. But for those who lean into the waiting pattern theory, it goes a step further, because it's not just about being close, it's about prioritizing that closeness in moments where it wouldn't be questioned if you didn't. No one would have blamed Jimin for leaving earlier in El Paso. No one would have noticed if Jungkook exited separately. There's no expectation for them to move as one. And yet, time and time again, they do. That's what turns small actions into meaningful ones. That's what transforms seconds into something unforgettable. As the El Paso moment continued to circulate, it became something of a reference point, a clip that fans could point to and say, "This is what we mean." Because it was clear, recent, undeniable, a moment where waiting wasn't hidden within a crowd or obscured by camera angles. It was visible, and more importantly, it was felt. Comments poured in, each one adding a layer to the collective interpretation. It's the way he didn't even hesitate. He looked like he knew exactly who he was waiting for. This isn't new. We just didn't see it before. And maybe that last comment captured the essence of it all, because sometimes the most meaningful patterns aren't the ones that start suddenly. They're the ones that have been there all along, waiting to be noticed. El Paso didn't create the narrative, it revealed it. And in doing so, it gave fans something rare, not just a moment to admire, but a thread to follow, a quiet storyline built not on declarations, but on decisions, not on words, but on timing, a pattern of staying, of pausing, of choosing not to leave just yet. If there's one thing that stands out above everything else, it's this. In a world that constantly pushes forward towards the next stage, the next city, the next moment, there's something profoundly moving about choosing to stop, even for a few seconds, even when no one asks you to. Because those seconds, they add up. They become habits, and habits over time become something much harder to ignore. Call it coincidence, call it comfort, call it whatever feels right. But for many fans, one idea continues to hold strong. It's not coincidence, it's a pattern, and patterns always have a story behind them. The only question now is how much of that story we've already seen, and how much is still quietly unfolding, one small pause at a time. Because if El Paso proved anything, it's this. Sometimes the loudest feelings aren't the ones that are spoken. They're the ones that show up in the quietest choices, like staying behind in a crowded room just to make sure you don't walk out alone. And maybe, just maybe, that's why this moment refuses to fade, because it doesn't feel like something staged. It feels like something real, something repeated, something chosen again and again, until it becomes impossible not to notice. And as the tour continues, as more cities pass and more stages light up, fans will keep watching. Not just for the big moments, the high notes, the performances that shake entire arenas, but for the pauses, the seconds in between, the moments where movement slows just enough to reveal something deeper. Because sometimes the story isn't in what happens on stage, it's in who you wait for when it's over. And if this really is a pattern, then El Paso might not be the conclusion. it might just be the clearest clue we've had so far. So now, all eyes are on what comes next. Because if history has shown anything, this won't be the last time someone chooses to stay.